But today we are focusing on creating intervention plans. And before we get started, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping to ensure that we have the best virtual learning experience. So this session is being recorded and it will be sent out to all registrants by next week. All attendee video and microphones have been muted, so you don't have to worry about that. A copy of the session slides for today was emailed to you earlier this week and yesterday, along with a blank intervention plan that you'll use later in this session. So make sure you have that accessible. If you have questions, please use the chat. We'll do our best to answer your questions today in real time. If for any reason we are unable to, we'll make sure to get back to you as soon as possible with more information. After this session, a link to complete a brief evaluation about today's training will be provided in the chat box, and we do appreciate your feedback. And as a reminder, if you signed up to receive childcare training credit and/or CEUs, you must view this session this morning live in its entirety. And if you do have questions about that, please feel free to reach out to Skippy, which is scpi@mailbox.sc.edu. So I'm Carrie Kennengeiser. I'm the Program Coordinator for South Carolina Partnerships for Inclusion, but I'm going to pass it along to our presenter, Dr. Jennifer Grisham. Thank you all.
Thank you, Carrie. It's nice to be back with you all today. I appreciate those of you who have hung in there with us for 2 sessions now. We're talking today about intervention planning, but for those of you who were with us last week, you'll remember that we didn't quite finish talking about evidence-based practices for learners who have low incidence disabilities. I've put this slide back up just to remind you that there are a number of evidence-based practices that have been used in the literature to teach children with low incidence disabilities a variety of different skills. We're focusing in this training on 3 categories, if you will, of practices. The enhanced milieu teaching, or sometimes called naturalistic language intervention, which we talked about last week. We're also today going to talk about system of least prompts and also the time delay procedures. I want to remind you that in this session, you'll sometimes hear me refer to low incidence disabilities, and it was suggested I redefine that. In this group of sessions, what we are talking about are learners who have significant disabilities, would be another word that I would use for that. They are learners who have dual sensory impairments, learners with multiple disabilities, learners with severe and profound intellectual disabilities. And they can be children who have autism, have cerebral palsy, have a variety of different syndromes that lead to any of those groups of characteristics. And so that is our focus for this session. Most of these children are children that are not formal or symbolic communicators. And so we are focusing heavily in this because we're patterning this after the pyramid model. We're focusing on social communication and social emotional teaching of young children with low incidence disabilities. So I'm going to move along to talk about the system of least prompts procedure. And before I do that, I would like for you all to please put up the poll to see what folks' familiarity is with the system of least prompts procedure. Okay. Looks like many of you all have some familiarity with the procedure. And so that's good to know. That's wonderful. Continue to let you vote. Okay. So the majority of you are somewhat familiar with this. Thank you. I'll stop sharing that now. Let's see. I don't know how to do that. There we go. I'll get rid of that. All right. So the definition of system of least prompts is that it is a systematic teaching strategy, or what I would refer to as a tier 3 strategy, that uses the least intrusive prompt necessary for the child to produce the target skill. So let me detangle a little bit of terminology here. When we talk about prompts, which I will discuss in a little bit, we're talking about additional support that we give to a child so that we can shape the target behavior that we're trying to teach. And those target behaviors can be both chained behaviors or also discrete tasks. When I say chained behaviors, I'm talking about skills like dressing or washing your hands or any of those types of behaviors that have multiple steps to them. Discrete behaviors are single responses that a child gives. So if I'm asking a child to sign more or to share a toy with another child or to take a turn, those are discrete tasks that a child does. And so system of least prompts has been used for both chained and discrete tasks. We're going to focus on the use of system of least prompts today on using it to teach social skills or play skills to young children who have low incidence disabilities. When we talk about the prompt hierarchy, we're going to start with the least intrusive prompt. And the least intrusive prompt means that it is the least amount of support that a child needs in order to demonstrate the response. And so when we're using this procedure, we first of all give the child an opportunity to demonstrate the response correctly before we start giving them prompts. Many times when working with children with low incidence disabilities, there are concerns about prompt dependency, where a child will only respond after an adult does something to support the child. And so the beauty of the system of least prompts procedure for children with low incidence disabilities is that it gives them that opportunity to do something on their own before we give them any level of support. And we move through a hierarchy, if you will, from the least amount of support to the most amount of support as we're teaching the task. The other characteristic of system of least prompts is that there is a delay interval. You'll remember last week, we talked about the importance of giving the child an opportunity to process what it is that we're asking of them to do. And so as we move through the prompt hierarchy, with each time before we give that additional support, we're going to wait a specified amount of time. So when we say delay interval, that is the length of time that we wait between giving each of the prompts in the hierarchy. And then also, the prompt hierarchy is going to be individualized based on the individual characteristics of the child. If a child has a visual impairment, a severe visual impairment, we're probably not going to use a visual model. For children who are deaf-blind, we talk a lot about, instead of using hand over hand physical prompting, we use hand under hand physical prompting. For children who have hearing impairments, they may have to use, instead of verbal speech, they may have to have sign language or gestures or some other form of visual prompt in order for them to be able to get the additional information. And so the type of prompt that we use is going to be dependent on the child's characteristics. And so it's just meant to be a reference of the different types of prompts that we would use in system of least prompts. Of course, an indirect verbal prompt is more like a hint. So if I'm teaching a child to, and asking a child to share a toy with someone else, instead of saying, give the toy to the other child, which would be a direct prompt, I would say, what are you supposed to do next? Which would be an indirect verbal prompt. Gestures, as you all know, is just, moving in the direction of what the child is supposed to do. We can use verbal, we can use physical models with a child. With children who have sensory impairments and deaf blindness, we oftentimes use tactile prompts, which could be a touch cue where we touch a part of the child's body to tell them, give them information about what they're supposed to do next, or we give the child an object to give them information to let them know what they're supposed to do next. We can also use physical prompts, as I mentioned, which are hand over hand or hand under hand for children who have sensory impairments. And then we can use visual or pictorial prompts. Oftentimes with children, like children who have autism, we will use pictorial prompts to tell them what the next step is that they're supposed to use. And so these are the different prompts that we can use with a child, with children who have low incidence disabilities. So the steps of a system of least prompts procedure are, first of all, we give the task request. And the task request is the direction that we want the child to follow. So if I'm trying to get a child to share a toy with another child, then the task request is share your toy with your friend. And so I give that task request to the child, and then I wait. And we talked again last week about the importance of individualizing the amount of time that we wait for a child to respond. And we talked about the fact that when children have multiple disabilities, physical disabilities, and sensory impairments, that it may take them a long time to process information. And so giving the child sufficient time to process that task request is very important. If the child doesn't respond independently, then we give the least intrusive prompt. And so oftentimes that least intrusive prompt might be, it could be a gesture, it could be a verbal prompt, it could be a model. We decide what that least intrusive prompt is for that individual child. Then we wait for the child to respond again. If the child responds correctly to it, then the sequence stops and we provide reinforcement for the child or give the child affirmation that they've done what it is we expected them to do. Or the environment might reinforce the child just simply because the child is now getting reinforcement from the environment. If the child does not do it again a second time, then we give what we call the controlling prompt. And I know we don't like to use that word a lot in education, especially around children with disabilities, but a lot of this information is rooted in behavioral terminology. And so basically what a controlling prompt is, it's the prompt that is going to ensure that the child demonstrates the correct response. And so oftentimes those take the form of some kind of a physical prompt that we give to the child. And then regardless of when the child responds, then we give the child the consequences, which means that we're giving them the feedback to demonstrate that they have done the correct response. If this is a chained task, if this is a chain, meaning it has multiple steps to it, then we use that sequence for every step in the process. As is the case last week, I've also provided you with a flow chart, if this is a little bit easier to understand, that shows how we contextualize using the system of least prompts. We're joining the child in a play situation and we're securing their attention. Those two things are always important. And as we move into intervention planning today, we're actually going to plan for how we gain a child's attention and how we establish a topic for them, because nobody learns if you don't have their attention. Some of you all may be sitting out there today and, you're shopping on Amazon, I won't have any way of knowing that. But when we're interacting directly with children, we have to have their attention before we can expect them to learn anything. And so we give that general task request and then we wait for the child to respond. If the child responds correctly, then they get affirmation, they get access to an activity, and or they get descriptive verbal praise. How that correct response is consequented is going to be very dependent on the child in the situation. If the child does it incorrectly, then we give that least intrusive prompt. We give a gesture or we give a verbal prompt. to tell them what to do next. And then I wait. And if the child doesn't do it again, then I give that that prompt, which again, controlling in this situation simply means giving the child enough support so that they can demonstrate the correct response. Children have to have access to what the correct response is. And a lot of times what happens is in teaching is that we get into these teaching loops, and I'll allude to this later, where we just keep asking the same question over and over without scaffolding that learning and giving them that additional support. And so with system of least prompts, we're being very intentional about how we're delivering those prompts so that the child can get some access to the actual correct response, if you will. So I'm going to show you a very short, brief clip of, this was actually done at our lab school. And this is a brief clip of, hang on, I go pull it up first. Sorry, guys. Of a little boy in our classroom who needed some help sharing. This is not actually a child with a low incidence disability, but it is a really good example of how the system of least prompts is used to teach that particular skill set.
Yep. Don't forget to share with your friends. Here you go. You can be a robot too. All right, we got 2 robots. Thanks for sharing.
All right, let me walk you through what you're seeing here. So you're seeing Colin, the teacher, and he's with Aiden, the little boy.
Yep.
And so what he does is at the beginning, he gives him materials to share with his friend. He then waits to see whether or not Aiden is going to share his materials or not. He then gives a verbal prompt and said, share with your friend. He then waits again, and then he gestures, or maybe he models. I'll have to look at it again. Either gestures or models what he's supposed to do. He waits again, and then when he doesn't do it, he delivers the controlling prompt, which is the prompt that's going to ensure that he does it, which in this case is a full physical prompt. So let's watch again.
Don't forget to share with your friends. Here you go. You can be a robot too. All right, we got 2 robots. Thanks for sharing.
So oftentimes, you know, we work with children who engage more with adults than they do with other children. And you can see that when he said, share your materials with your friend, he shared them with Colin and he didn't share them with his friend. And so that procedure, when I first started teaching, that was a procedure that we used primarily in teaching adaptive skills and teaching dressing and hand washing and, you know, other kinds of self-care skills. But now we're using that, and there is some really good literature to show the effectiveness of using the system of least prompts procedure in teaching social skills to young children. So I will pause there as I ask you all to put up the next poll on constant time delay and see if there are any questions about system of least prompts. Again, it looks like the majority of you all are somewhat familiar with the time delay procedure. And I know I'm asking you to do two things at one time, but Carrie, please share with me if there are any questions about system of least prompts. I think that probably what you all will see as we go through these procedures is that these are things that oftentimes teachers do intuitively. They do them kind of automatically, if you will. The issue is that, when we're talking about using these procedures at tier 3, the importance is that we're doing them consistently and that we're being intentional about how we are implementing the intervention. We know from research that it's important that teachers implement intervention with fidelity in order for it to be effective and for children to actually learn the skills that we want them to. And so that's the reason why it's so important to make all of these decisions regarding how to implement the intervention. So 61% of you all have some experience with system of least prompts, or with the delay intervals. Too many things up on my screen. I can't get rid of everything. All right, so let's talk about time delay, constant time delay. With the time delay procedure, you're choosing one prompt that's called the controlling prompt. And you are giving the task direction, and then you are the amount of time between when you ask that task direction and when you give that controlling prompt remains consistent throughout instruction. And so very simply, if I were to say to a child, if I were teaching a child, what do you want? And I was saying to the child, what do you want? And I wait 5 seconds, and then I say, more. You want more. All right. And so I immediately give that controlling prompt to the child, which in that case would be a model. It might also be, I was looking at some video in advance of this, where Donna Carpenter and I from Kentucky, we work with a little boy, and they were using a time delay procedure with him, and she was using hand under hand physical prompting to get him to sign more. And so the controlling prompt, again, will be dependent on the needs of the individual child. But you're only using one prompt. Unlike with system of least prompts, where you're using a hierarchy, you're using all different types of prompts. With the time delay procedures, you are using just one prompt. So with constant time delay, that delay interval between when I give the task request and when I use that controlling prompt remains the same throughout the instruction. There are, however, we do start the instruction with what we call 0 delay interval, so that the child gets an opportunity to know what the expected response is. And so I say, what do you want? You want more. And I immediately give the prompt. That's called a 0-second delay interval. And I do that for 1 or 2 sessions with the child. And then after that, then I'm using that constant delay interval with the child. So, so here's what the 0-second delay interval is. I get the child's attention, and then I present the child with the task request. What do you want? Or share your toy with the child. That sets the occasion for the child to respond, and then I immediately give the prompt. So if we rethink what Colin was doing with Aiden in that video, if he was using the time delay procedure, then he would say, share your material, and then he would immediately help Aiden give it to his friend. So he would immediately go to that physical prompt, that controlling prompt, to teach him that. That would be 0-second delay interval. With the constant delay interval, he would get the child's attention. He would say, share the toy, and then he would wait 4 seconds, and then he would immediately go to that physical prompt of helping him share the toy with his friend. So I'm not going through that whole prompt hierarchy. And so Deciding on which of this type of procedures you want to use, really depends on, the child. If you are concerned that the child is going to become prompt dependent, what you want to try to do is to give them an opportunity to demonstrate the correct response independently before you jump in and give that correct response. I worked with a child one time when I was teaching who was she was completely blind, and she was so prompt dependent. I mean, I was trying to fade her prompts, trying to get her to do an independent task, and I had it faded down to her just barely touching the top of her hand. But she would not start a task, initiate a task, independently until I finally faded that one little tiny physical prompt from her. And so when we use a lot of hand over hand or hand under hand with children without giving them a chance to, independently, perform the task, then we set in motion sometimes with these children that prompt dependency that is very, very hard to break. And so with both the constant time delay and also with the system of least prompts, we're giving them an opportunity to do it independently before we present that prompt level. So I'm waiting 4 seconds, and then I'm giving the child the opportunity to respond. And regardless of whether or not I have to give the prompt or not, I still give the child the positive feedback for demonstrating the correct response. So here's what the delay procedure looks like in a flow chart. Again, what we are doing is that we are setting the occasion for the child to demonstrate the response, which means that I have to engage that child in an activity that allows me an opportunity to teach the skill that I'm trying to teach. So obviously, if I'm trying to teach sharing or turn taking or a play skill, then I'm going to have to engage the child in an activity with an adult or with a peer so that that child has an opportunity to engage with materials that are interesting to the child that they're going to want to share or take a turn experiencing. I've got to get that child's attention in one way or the other. For children with sensory impairments, I may have to use a touch cue. I may have to give the child the opportunity to touch the object that they're trying to engage with. But I want to make sure that I have that child's attention, whether they're visually focusing or they're turning toward, or I know that I have that child's attention. And once I've done that, then I can give the general task to request or task direction. And I apologize, I keep using words interchangeably, but the task direction or task request, the antecedent, if you will, all of those are the same thing. It's what I do as the adult to give the child an opportunity to demonstrate the correct response. Once I've done that, then if I'm using the 0-second delay, which I do with this procedure, then I immediately give the controlling prompt. After I've done that 0-second delay interval for 1 to 3 seconds, then I go to the constant delay interval. And you'll see I've got here 3, 4, or 5 seconds, and I wait that period of time and see if the child is able to do it independently. Again, the delay interval is going to be dependent on the child and their needs. If the child does it correctly, so this correct response, then I'm going to affirm. Yeah, you shared with your friend, you took a turn, you said more, you asked for help. I'm going to give descriptive verbal praise, and then I'm going to provide access to what it is the child wanted. If the child doesn't do it correctly, then I'm going to give that controlling prompt. And then if they still don't do it correctly, I'm going to ignore and go on to the next opportunity. So I'm not going to take the time to show a video of the time delay procedure right now, but I do want to pause long enough to see if there are any general questions about using system of least prompts or the or the time delay. I have gone over in 10 minutes what takes generally about a class. If I was teaching a class to talk about each of these procedures. I've given you all some resources that are excellent for learning more about how to use these procedures. Belva Collins has a book out on systematic instructional practices. In our blended practices book, we also discuss each of these procedures that we've talked about, and we give examples of how you can use them in the classroom. Those are two good resources that you might use to find out more and learn more about these procedures. Carrie, are there any questions?
No, I don't see any questions in the chat. So if anyone has questions, feel free to pop it in the chat and we'll get back to it.
All right, super. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch to our next presentation, which is where we're going to start talking about how to design intervention plans to implement these Tier 3 interventions. And so let me close this one. So this is now session 2, where we should have started at the beginning of the hour. So you should be seeing session 2 up there. Can somebody confirm for me that that's correct?
Yes.
This is Carrie.
All right, super, thank you. All right, so our objectives for this session are to gain knowledge on embedded learning opportunities and to develop an intervention plan that can be implemented with a child with low incidence disabilities. So Carrie shared with you all a blank intervention plan that you all will need to take out at this point. You all have been listening to me now for well over 30 minutes, and you listened to me last week. And so we want to give you all an opportunity now to actually use some of the strategies that I'm going to be teaching you about. Our goal is that by the end of today's session, that you all will design an intervention plan that you will implement with a child or with a child's family to help support them to do Tier 3 instruction with that child in whatever location they are spending time right now. It could be virtual preschool, it could be virtual home visits. Maybe some of you all are face-to-face. Donna Carpenter and I use the intervention plan a lot when we are coaching families as we are working with them. And so the intervention plan is really the recipe for how to do Tier 3 instruction. And before we get into actually talking about what an intervention plan is, it's based on this notion of embedded learning opportunities. And so I'd like for you all to put up the poll right now to see what folks' knowledge is of using embedded learning opportunities for teaching learners with low incidence disabilities.
And this is Carrie. I'm just going to pop in. My apologies. I did not see the Q&A box. I was just looking at the chat. So while folks are filling in that poll, we did have one question, Dr. Grisham. For extreme behaviors like hitting and biting, would it be better to do the 0 second?
Yes. And I will say that also, you know, a lot of times, even if after we start and we get to the point where we are using the constant delay interval, once we start that, if the child is not making any progress, then we want to go back to that 0 second delay interval and give the child more practice with what the correct response is before we move back to the delay interval again. All right, looks like the data are, you know, kind of more of you all are very familiar, I think, with embedded learning opportunities. This is a recommended practice for working with young children. And it's interesting because the notion of embedded learning opportunities, which is basically teaching skills within the context of daily activities and routines. for me, in my own learning, it has its roots in the field of low incidence disabilities or severe and profound disabilities. When I was teaching school, I taught in a classroom working with children who had multiple disabilities, sensory impairments, and autism, all in the same classroom. And it was the only classroom of its type in our entire school district at the time. And my first professional development, once I graduated from college, actually was from the Deaf Blind Project in our state. And one of the first practices that they started teaching us was something that was called individualized curriculum sequencing, or ICS. And it was this notion really of embedding skills within activities and routines. Because you see, back years ago, the way that we taught learners who had low incidence disabilities is that we taught those discrete skills individually. And so we decontextualized everything that we, everything that we taught. And so, there was a time of day on the schedule when we taught communication. There was a time of day when we taught fine motor skills. There was a time of day when we taught gross motor skills. And I suggest that that's probably still true in some segregated low incidence classrooms. And so this notion of contextualizing our teaching was very new to me as a young teacher many, many years ago. But that notion is something now that is, it's something that we talk about all the time in early intervention. We talk about all the time when we talk about implementing developmentally appropriate practices for young children, which is that we don't want to segregate children out and teach discrete skills individually, but rather we want those skills to be taught within the context of what children enjoy doing with materials that the child is motivated about, and around other children that are part of their context. And so embedded learning opportunities in some form or fashion has really been around for a very, very long time. The definition that I'm going to use today is that it emphasizes identifying preferred times and activities, preferred meaning those things that are motivating and novel and interesting to children that are going to get their attention. When we intentionally and systematically teach a child a priority skill, and that we do that within typically occurring activities, routines, and transitions. And so in some early work that was done, where we talked about activity-based instruction, which is another word for embedded learning opportunities, we talked about really kind of 3 times a day when we could embed teaching opportunities. One of those would be routine activities. And so for those of you who work with children with very low incidence disabilities, there are times of the day when we have to do diaper changing, when we have to perhaps feed a child with a G-tube, when we're engaged in a lot of routine activities. And so thinking about how those routine activities can be part of a child's learning experience is very important. There are also planned activities. And so in a classroom, the teacher may lead a small group activity or a large group activity where all of the children, where it's planned, when there are certain materials that are being used. And so those planned activities, routine and planned, and then the transitions would be the third kind of activity that we would do that are, again, part of the activity. I'm sorry, I forgot. It's not, transitions are routines. I apologize. So it's planned, routine, and the third type is child initiated. And so this is basically, whatever the child is engaged in, whatever they are interested in preschool and early intervention, we want a lot of the activity the child is involved in to be that which they are most interested in. And so allowing children to, engage in activities that they're interested in and following that child's lead is an important part of embedded learning opportunities. So some considerations for implementing embedded learning opportunities is that the instruction needs to occur in activities and routines that are of interest to the child. And that we use those embedded learning opportunities to teach high priority skills. Recall from last week that I listed for you all the social emotional, and the social communication skills that would be appropriate outcomes for learners with low incidence disabilities to teach. How to interact with your environment, how to interact with adults in your environment, how to interact with peers in your environment are among the social emotional skills that we discussed. We also talked about with social communication skills, we talked about the importance of understanding the form and the function of a child's language communication attempts. And so requesting, protesting, telling someone that I'm done with something, telling somebody that I want to make a choice about something, getting somebody's attention, and then thinking about all the different forms of communication that a child can use, from change of muscle tone to pushing away, to using gestures, to using more symbolic forms of communication, such as sign language or verbal speech. So teaching those high priority skills is what we want to focus on when we are using embedded learning opportunities. And the most critical part here is planning, that we have to plan to ensure that embedded learning opportunities actually occur. And and I've just kind of talked about a little bit here about what priority skills are. They are foundational skills that a child needs in order to a milestone perhaps that a child has not met by a given age. A barrier to learning. So if the child is a non-English language learner, then that's going to be a barrier to the child's learning. If the child has severe challenging behavior, then that's the first thing that I'm going to work on. If the child and also is missing a prerequisite skill, if the child cannot pay attention, if the child can't establish joint attention, I'm going to have to teach that prerequisite skill before I can teach anything else. And the reason why I'm focusing so much on priority skills is that high priority skills is that I'm a firm believer that if we are going to effectively include children with low incidence disabilities in inclusive environments, then we are going to have to be intentional and we're going to have to plan. And that means write it down and implement with fidelity, whatever it is that we want to teach the child. And so the type of planning that I'm sharing with you all today is not something that necessarily might be part of what the type of planning that you are currently doing wherever you are teaching or you are working. And therefore, it is something that is in addition to. And I know that teachers have many, many competing demands on their time. And so before I tell you or ask you to do yet another form or another different process for how to plan, I need to emphasize the fact that we're not doing this form of planning for every single thing that we are teaching children. We are focusing on those skills that a child is missing that are preventing the child from accessing and participating in and making progress toward the general curriculum. So it's those priority skills, it's those IEP goals that we should be focusing on. And now that I'm off my little pedestal here, there's someone raised their hand. And so I don't know if that means there's a question or not, Carrie.
I'm not sure. We've just instructed everyone to make sure to use the chat or the Q&A box for questions. So if something pops up, we will let you know.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
So to illustrate and highlight my point, I'm going to show you a little video clip. Several years ago, I had a research grant, and our goal was to effectively include children with low incidence disabilities into regular classroom settings. And so we trained the teachers on how to assess young children. We trained them on how to identify priority goals. We trained them on how to identify activities and routines in which they could embed those skills. And then we went into the classrooms and we started videotaping them. And we just said to them, we said, just show us a time during the day when you are actually providing instruction to a child on a priority skill that you've identified. And I won't show you the whole videotape, but this is one of the videos that we got.
It's relaxing. It's going to sleep.
So why am I showing you a picture of a little girl eating? This was a lesson to me and kind of a turning point in my work that I do with teams and in the research that I do. So this little girl who was a focused child in this classroom, she has cerebral palsy, she has a visual impairment. And in this video, if we were face to face, I would ask you, well, what do you think the priority skill was? And some people would say feeding herself or, drinking from a cup. Other people might say, sitting in a chair independently. There are lots of questions, but it's really unclear here what exactly is going on. The truth of the matter is that the target skill, the priority skill for this child was initiating interactions with her peers. And there are some things that the teacher got right here. She has her at a table with other children. She has her engaged in something that she's clearly, she likes to eat. That's clear. And so, but embedding learning opportunities goes beyond this. It's about intentionally embedding those evidence-based practices that I've highlighted for you all within the context of an activity like this. Merely placing a child in an activity does not ensure that the child is going to get an opportunity to demonstrate the skill that we want. And so there has to be an adult there that's perhaps prompting a peer. There has to be some arrangement of the environment. There has to be an opportunity for this child to initiate an interaction, to talk about something. But placing the child in an activity in and of itself does not an embedded learning opportunity make. And perhaps that is, common sense. But what we found over the 4 years that we had this research grant was that all of the teaching about how to assess children, how to identify target skills, how to identify activities was not enough. That in fact, what we had to do is that we had to teach them how to be planful about how to create these embedded learning opportunities. And so in order to do that, we had to teach them about the parts of what an embedded learning opportunity is, and we had to help them develop intervention plans to do that. So if I am to break apart an embedded learning opportunity, it has 3 pieces to it. It has the antecedent, which is everything that we do to set up the occasion for the child to learn. If I go back to this video here, they did some of those things right. They set her at the table with other children. She's kind of sort of positioned okay. She has access to the same materials as other children do. But the how part of this is not evidence. the creating the opportunities, setting the occasion for her, to demonstrate initiation is not evidenced in that particular situation. The second thing is that everybody needs to be clear about what the response is that we want to expect of the child. This is so important with children with low incidence disabilities, especially when we're talking about behaviors that fall into that social emotional or that social communication area. I've seen children, Donna and I worked with a little boy, and this is what he did. He did this kind of behavior a lot. And so we were trying to shape that behavior into a more response. So this kind of flapping, that couldn't be more. But if he brought his fingers together and they stayed together for a period of time, then we could say that that was the correct response. And so everybody in that child's environment needs to understand that if I turn my head away and shut my eyes, that means no. Or if my muscle tone increases, that means I don't like that. Everybody needs to understand, it needs to be written down what it is a correct response and what is not a correct response. And then finally, we need to figure out what is it that we do to keep the instruction going, how do we provide extra support? How do we reinforce the child? So what happens after the child responds? And so the way in which we do this is through the intervention plan. And the intervention plan is the depiction of the ARC, or this right here, the antecedent, the response, the consequence. Now, if you are someone that is sitting in the audience and you're concerned about that behavioral terminology, then you can take those words off of your intervention plan and you can just say what happens before the child responds, what is the child's response, and what happens after the child responds. Last week, Donna and I were doing the coaching sessions, and I even changed it to say, what do we do first to set up the situation? What does the child do? And then what do we do after the child responds? And so what we're trying to do is to develop a plan that is consistently followed so that the child learns the target skill. And if it's not working, then we need to change it, because this is an ongoing living, breathing document. And if we try it and we implement it consistently and we implement it with fidelity and it's still not working, then we need to change the plan. When I was an undergraduate, I had a professor who always said, children don't fail, teachers fail. And that's always stuck with me, that if I'm implementing a plan and it's not working, that it's not something the child is necessarily doing wrong, it's something I need to change. And that's what an intervention plan is intended to do. It's to help you teach you to be consistent and then to change that plan if it's not working. Remembering again that we're designing these intervention plans for children who need Tier 3 instruction on priority skills that are preventing that child's access to, participation in, and ability to make progress toward the general curriculum. All right, so let's get started. The first part of the intervention plan are the antecedents. It's everything that happens that sets the occasion for the child to demonstrate the response. So the antecedents can be provided by adults, by peers, or by the environment. The antecedent for me, which I'm going to do right now, the antecedent for me taking a drink of water, what I'm going to do right now, is that I'm thirsty. That's an antecedent. All right. An antecedent for a child, pushing away a bowl or pushing away an activity is that they're tired of that. That's the antecedent. When we're developing antecedents, what we want to stay away from is interrupting and disrupting learning. Rather, we want to enhance and shape and expand that learning. So in other words, if a child is engaged in something that they really are enjoying, we don't want to interrupt that child and, ask them to do something that's unrelated to that. And I can't think of a better example than of one that I saw one time in our preschool, where a child was engaged with stacking cups and saucers, and he was stacking one cup and one saucer on top of the other, and he was trying to move those cups and saucers over to another table, and it would fall, and he would go back and he would try to arrange that cup and saucer again, and he'd get over there and it would fall again. So while he was doing what he was learning from that antecedent, he had this desire he was problem solving. In the middle of this really neat learning experience, the teacher says, "What color is that cup? Tell me what color that cup is." Well, she was disrupting the child's learning at that point because he didn't care about what color that cup was. What he was concerned about is getting those cups from one place to the next. And so the antecedent the word I use sometimes, it needs to emanate from what the child is involved in. And so when the child is engaged, when the child is interested in something, then that's when we can deliver that antecedent or that situation to generate the response. So they're thought of as the strategies that create this learning opportunity for the child. So I'm going to talk to you about on your intervention plan. If you will look at that right now, I'm going to talk to you about the parts of the antecedent that we need to consider. We first of all need to consider when we're going to teach. So some things that we need to consider are times of day. For some of the children that we work with, there are better times of day for them to learn. There's no doubt about it. They are more alert at certain times of day. They are less agitated at certain times of day. And so we need to think about what is the best time of day that I can provide this instruction. We also need to think about the routines or the activities that are motivating and interesting to the child. We also need to think about transitions as an opportunity for providing instruction. We need to think about the start and the stop of an activity as a time. So if I'm getting materials out to play with the child, or if I'm putting materials away at the end of an activity, that can be an opportunity to teach the child. Remember last week, my example of giving the child limited access to materials. So if I'm beginning to play an activity, to engage a child in a play activity, and I put that material in a see-through container that the child can't open, then I'm creating an opportunity at the start of that activity for the child to communicate that they need help. And then when the child is with other adults. So that's the first thing, is when to teach. The second thing is where to teach. What's the location? And considering that we want to do this outside of the building, we want to do it in spaces that are within the classroom, and we want to do it at sites and areas in the classroom. If you're a person out there that's working directly with families, this can be modified to think about areas in their home when they can actually embed the instruction. The goal with embedded learning opportunities, however, is that we want to have, at least 2 or 3 opportunities throughout the day that we embed those learning opportunities, so that the child has an opportunity to generalize the skill across a variety of locations and a variety of times during the day. We also want to think about things that the child, that we can use to teach with. And so materials that are motivating for a child to address their sensory and physical needs. And so I've just listed a few here. Tactile books, music is often something that's very motivating to children with low incidence disabilities, toys that vibrate, For children who have visual impairments, objects that have reflective properties or move, such as a fan or bubbles, or for children with physical disabilities, switch toys, like the one I've got here with Tigger. The next and most important part of this is how to set the occasion. And so there are 4 parts to this how component. The first is that we have to get the child's attention. So my example here is that I might use hand under hand for the child to the child's palm. So some way of letting the child know, this would of course be for a child who has a visual impairment, to let the child know that I'm there, I'm going to try to engage in an interaction with you. The second is to establish the topic. So what is it that we're going to do? So I might sign and also verbally say it's calendar time. Or I might say to the child, it's time for us to play. Or I might say, we're going to play with our friend today. But in some way, I'm going to establish the topic about what it is that's about to happen. The next thing is I'm going to make a request in a format that the child can understand. So in the example here, I'm saying and signing to the child, what comes next in your day? It might be share your toy with your friend. It might be, what do you want? It might be take your turn. But any of those things that are going to set the occasion. And again, the most important thing here is to wait for the child to process the information. And I think this is something that you have to kind of play around with a little bit. I've had children that it's taken 20 seconds for them to process a response. The key here, I think, is to remember that we're trying to determine processing time, is that we want to give the child enough time to process so that they are challenged, so that we're not just jumping in and immediately telling them what to do, all right? But we don't want to wait so long that the child is frustrated. So particularly if I'm trying to teach the child communication skills and I'm trying to get the child to request, if I wait too long, then for a child who's trying to get me to give them some more milk in their cup, then the child can get frustrated and just throw the milk, all right? And so I don't want to wait too long so that the child is not frustrated, but I want to wait long enough so that the child has the opportunity to process what it is I'm trying to say to the child. So that's the antecedent. That's the where we teach, when we teach, with what we teach, and how we teach. All of that needs to be included on your intervention plan. So because I'm being mindful of the time, I'm being very mindful of the time, I'm going to just pause here and see if there are any questions.
Jennifer, I don't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A.
Okay. All right, then I'm going to move on, and I'm going to hope that once this is all over, that you all are going to be able to finish your intervention plan so that we can prepare for our next time. All right, the second component, or the second part of the intervention plan is, so somebody named Fines Black has raised their hand. Do you have a question? All right, I'll move along then. The second component of the intervention plan is to identify the behavior. And the behavior has to be something that is observable and measurable. Most of you all who have a background in any type of special education has heard this term before, that we have to have, when we're writing goals and objectives, that we have to have observable and measurable behaviors. those that can be seen and heard and that have a beginning and an end. I really want to focus on, when we're writing the intervention plan, that we identify specifically what constitutes a correct response and what constitutes an incorrect response. And so again, a behavior is a verb. It needs to be something that is seen and heard, so that everybody that is in that child's environment, everybody that understands that child, everybody is agreeing that this constitutes a communication or some kind of social response. And it also has to be a behavior that has a beginning and an end. So for the correct response, I need to be able to say what the level of independence is that the child can do. For some children with in low incidence disabilities, especially those with multiple disabilities, the child might, we might still use some kind of a prompt, and that might be considered independent for that child. So how independent does the child have to be in order for it to be considered a correct response? Are approximations acceptable? And so if I'm using sign language in particular, is an approximation of a specific response acceptable to consider it to be correct? Alternative behaviors. Oftentimes when we are teaching communication in particular, it might be the case that I might be trying to use both. Hope that, for example, a child use a tactile symbol and also sign language, which is the case with the child that Donna and I are working with right now. I might sometimes with children, with young children, I might start teaching them a sign language, but also accept a verbal approximation. And so I worked with a little girl a few years ago who had a verbal apraxia. And so we started out by teaching her sign language, but we accepted any verbalization that was close to what the message was as a correct response for that child. So as I'm defining and developing my intervention plan, I can indicate one or more responses that would be considered the correct response for the child. And then I also want to indicate in there what the latency is. So how long do I wait before I give that child any additional support? So all of that information needs to be written out on your intervention plan. The child will independently, the child will, if I'm using approximations, if I'm using alternative responses, and what is the latency, how long that the child before I give any extra support. An incorrect response is that the child does not respond at all. So I give the child 5 seconds to respond and they don't do anything. If the child does something, but it's incorrect. So if I'm expecting the child to share a toy with someone else and the child throws the toy, that would be an incorrect response. If I'm asking the child to ask for more and the child asks for help, that would be an incorrect response. And if the child takes too long to respond, that would also be considered a incorrect response. So as I'm developing my intervention plan, I want to consider all of these variables when I am writing out the plan, so that it's crystal clear to everybody that's looking at it that this is what the plan is supposed to look like. So this is your opportunity again to practice. I'll give a couple of minutes here for us to ask questions and for you all to jot some notes down. Moving forward, again, our goal is for you all to have some general idea about what your intervention plan might look like by the end of today. I'm going to be offering some additional support for you to develop your intervention plan. When we come back next time, our hope is that I'll be able to get some feedback from you all on what it was like implementing your intervention plan, or any additional support you need to develop it. Carrie, are there any questions about that?
Hi, Jennifer. I don't see any questions right now. I've just dropped the question asking if there are questions in the chat, and we'll see if any come in. This means
Okay.
everybody's got it, right?
Yeah, it's great. All right, the third and last component of the intervention plan, which is really in some ways the most important, are the consequences. This is the third column of your intervention plan. And the consequences are what happens after the child either demonstrates the correct or the incorrect response. And the consequences can be delivered by the adult that's working with the child, the peer that's interacting with the child, or an environmental event. So if I take a drink, again, because I'm thirsty, the consequence is that I get my thirst quenched. When we're using consequences, we want to use those that are logical, that will increase the likelihood that the behavior is going to occur again, that match what the child is interested in, and that are motivating to the child. And so oftentimes we use verbal praise with children. If we're going to use verbal praise or with children, then we need to use specific praise to acknowledge what it is that the child did that was correct. Oftentimes, we use the event in the environment that happened that gave the child feedback. And so if, again, the child is requesting something and the child gets it, then the environment really is what gives the feedback to the child. So if it is a correct response, if the child gets a correct response, then the adult or the peer can comment on the fact that the child has demonstrated this correct response by saying, "You shared with me," or you know, you're showing good sharing behavior, or whatever. And that also goes with the verbal praise. So the teacher or the peer can say something like, "Thank you for sharing your toy with me," or "You said you wanted more, so I'm going to give you more." So giving the child that language to let the child know what it is that they did correctly. The other thing that the teacher can do is to set it up so that the environment is set up so that the child gains access to whatever it is that they want. And so in my scenario that I talked about a few minutes ago, where the child is given a clear container with their favorite toy in it, and in order to get into that container, they have to ask for help. Then if the child asks for help so that the adult will help them get into that clear container, then getting access to that material is the consequence, is the positive feedback that the child needs. Now, I can pair that with saying, "You asked me for help, so I'm going to give you help," and then open the container and give the object to the child. So I can pair that specific verbal praise also with an environmental event that gives them access to what they want. In some cases, the child might be intrinsically reinforced for performing the skill. Intrinsic reinforcement is the highest level of reinforcement. And I always say to people, let's don't put too much stock in that, because most of us wouldn't be here today if we weren't getting somehow compensated for doing what we're doing today. And so, yes, there are times when interaction, for example, with another peer and gaining interaction with someone else is intrinsically reinforcing to a child. And so we may not have to do any of these other things. It might be the intrinsic love of doing something correctly that actually reinforces a child. But oftentimes we're going to have to add to that some kind of environmental event or praise so that the child is reinforced for doing what they're supposed to. The most important part really of the intervention plan is what we do if the child doesn't respond. So I'm going to give you a scenario that I saw in a classroom a few years ago where we had a little boy with vision impairments and Down syndrome. And his priority skill for the class was to follow one-step directions. That was on his IEP. It was something that we really needed for him to learn to follow the routines of the classroom. So one day I went in to observe, and he was sitting at the art table, and he was sitting there, and he was doing an art project. And after he finished whatever it was he was working on, the teacher's teaching assistant said to him, "Henry, put that in your cubby." All right. She set the occasion for the child to learn. It was embedded into a routine that he enjoyed. She gave the task request direction. But here's what happened. He didn't do it right away, so she didn't wait long enough. And so what she did instead is that she said, "Henry, put your artwork in your cubby." She said it a little bit louder. And he didn't do it. And almost immediately she said it slower. "Henry, put your artwork in your cubby." Still didn't work. And so she did this 3 or 4 times. She kept saying the same thing over which the antecedent. She kept saying it over and over and over again. And then finally, what did she do? She picked up the artwork and she put it in the cubby. So Henry didn't learn anything about what he was supposed to do. And part of the reason, 2 things went wrong there. First thing that went wrong was she kept repeating that task request, and she did not wait for him to respond. And I see teachers do this all the time. I had a grant a few years ago when we were supporting teachers of children with autism. And I observed a teacher, and she was asking a child to make choices. And she had these 2 colors in front of the child. And she said to the child, "Do you want red or do you want blue? Which one do you want? Tell me, do you want this one or do you want that one?" She just kept asking the same thing over and over and over again without time for the child to respond. And also not thinking about what she was going to do if the child did not respond. And that's what this section here is all about, is what do I do if the child doesn't respond? If I've adequately given that child time to respond and the child does not respond, or the child responds incorrectly, what happens then? That's what this is about. So what happens is that the teacher or the peer has to provide some kind of support for the child to respond. And so if I'm doing a constant time delay intervention, then I'm going to immediately, if I'm doing 0-second intervention, then I'm going to immediately maybe give a gesture to Henry to say, "Go put that over in your cubby." All right. I'm going to then wait and see whether or not that works or not. And again, depending on what kind of intervention I'm using, I may use that gesture again. Or if I'm using system of least prompts, then I may give a different type, and I may physically support Henry to walk over with his piece of artwork and go to his cubby and put it in his cubby. But I'm going to give enough support until the child actually has an opportunity to practice that skill that the child is supposed to demonstrate. So this, again, this is the most critical part of this, because I have to have a plan for what it is that the child is supposed to do. I've watched and been involved in countless coaching sessions and on grants and so forth. And this is the mistake that people make, is that they think that if they ask something of a child louder or more often or faster or with more emphasis, that the child's going to know what to do. But continuing to question a child or point to the materials or, whatever, does not give that child the support that they need to demonstrate that correct response. And so this part of the intervention plan is so critical, and is the part that when we're looking at fidelity of implementation, it's the part that people have the most difficulty with, aside from the wait time. The wait time and this are the most important, the biggest part. And I want to say to you all, when I talk about the importance of wait time, and when I talk about the importance of scaffolding and providing prompts, that I'm not just, this is not just something that's out of my head. It's something that, that I think that research has shown. One of the most important studies that I think I've ever been involved in is that when we had this big research project for children with autism, we started analyzing all of the steps of this intervention plan and looking at, what are the things that, getting a child's attention, that's important, making sure, understanding that the child understands the topic, set up the environment, all of those things were important. But when we looked at and analyzed our data and looked at what were the teaching behaviors that were most closely correlated with children learning social emotional and social communication skills, the two behaviors that were most important were the wait time and the prompting. And so this really what makes a difference in children learning new skills. And so I want to challenge you to really think through that process as you're doing your planning about if the child does it, great. I go back to and I reinforce the child. If the child doesn't do it, then what happens? If the child still doesn't do it, what happens? At some point, I have to provide that controlling prompt or that prompt that ensures that the child will demonstrate the correct response. So I still see hands being raised, but I don't know how to address those folks. So I hope that you all will put your questions in the chat box. We are getting close to the end of our time, and I know that Carrie has some other things that she wants to say, but I do want to offer up an opportunity for questions. Again, at our next session in January, our hope is that you will have developed and at least practiced implementing an intervention plan on a child, with a child with whom you work, or with the child's family with whom you work. These intervention plans are wonderful for providing a clear guidance to a family or to a team so that you're really focused on a skill that you can work on across activities and routines. During this period of time between now and January 8th, I'll be happy to answer any questions. I'll be happy to look at your intervention plans to support you in writing one of these. We designed this training so that it wouldn't just be about learning new information, but actually get you to the level of implementation. And so with that, Carrie, I'm going to turn it back to you and see where we are with questions and next steps.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. So I don't see any questions, but we still have about 5 minutes. So if anyone wants to pop that in the chat or the Q&A, they can. While they are doing that, I'm just going to share my screen to go over a few last points. Bear with me. So I did also drop the link in the chat box for the evaluation for today. So if you all don't mind taking a moment to just provide some feedback, we really appreciate it. It's helpful overall to see just what's happening with our trainings, but also since there will be a third session, if you have any particular feedback about these first two or questions that you had that you were a little shy to share today, please use that as well. I do see a question in the Q&A. See if I can get to that. So Dr. Grisham, someone said, how long do you think it should take for the student to learn the new skill?
Oh, Yeah, that's a really good question. It really depends on the child. It depends on the skill. It depends on the consistency with which you are implementing the intervention. I remember years ago we did a study where we had a little girl with visual impairments and cerebral palsy, and the occupational therapist had been working with her on trying to do some initial, like making mark using a writing implement. And we started we wrote an intervention plan and started being systematic about how we were doing it. And within, I don't know, maybe I'd have to look at the data, but it was within like 2 to 3 weeks, the child was doing this skill that the occupational therapist had been trying to teach for, a year. And she said, "How did you make that happen?" And the teacher said, "Well, we just implemented a systematic plan." And so I think that the results are oftentimes, kind of exciting for people because how quickly children can learn skills when we do implement with consistency and being systematic.
Thanks.
The other part of that is that when we're implementing Tier 3 instruction, this is a whole other session, is that we need to collect data regularly. And I know as early childhood providers, we have to collect a lot of data. And that is, the bane of our existence. But when we're implementing something that is this important, it's important for us to collect data regularly, meaning no less than a couple of times a week, to see whether or not the child is making progress or not. If the child is not making progress, then we need to go back to that plan and see whether or not there's something about it that we can change or should change.
Thanks, Dr. Grisham. Are there any other questions? Well, if there are no questions, again, if you think of something, you can feel free to reach out. But I want to take a minute to just thank everyone who participated today and gave up some of your time on this Friday early afternoon. And special thanks to Dr. Grisham and our sign language interpreters. We also really appreciate our friends at the South Carolina Deafblind Project and the Kentucky Deafblind Project for collaborating and supporting us. Again, I've dropped that link in the chat box for the evaluation for today's session, and I will leave that open until next Friday. We really do love your feedback and appreciate it. You will receive an email early next week with the recording from today. So anyone who couldn't be with us live can watch that recording before our next session. And also, if you just want to review the information, feel free. You'll also receive a link next week and early January for the last session in this series on implementation and evaluation. And that will take place on January 8th. But we're trying to keep you on your toes because that one will be a little bit earlier than these last two sessions. That will start at 9:30 in the morning and will end at 11. If you would like any information about South Carolina Partnerships for Inclusion and the services and supports that we provide, you can check out our website, which is posted on the screen for you. Feel free to use the Contact Us button or to email us for more information. And again, that email is right there. It's scpi@mailbox.sc.edu. And make sure to sign up for our newsletter if you're not already, because we send out updates and alerts on other training opportunities that are happening and resources. So someone asked in the chat, what's the next date and time again? It's Friday, January 8th after the holidays, and it will be a bit earlier, 9:30 in the morning to 11 in the morning. We know we were trying to accommodate a variety of folks' schedules, which was a bit tricky, which is why we switched it up a little bit and also are sharing the recordings for folks who are not able to join us live, because we know people are teaching and working and just trying to navigate this virtual life. So thanks again, everyone. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. Have a wonderful weekend and a safe and happy holiday season. Bye, all. Thanks, everyone.